This presentation, Improving Stream and Floodplain Resiliency Post-Disaster, was given at the North Carolina Association of Soil and Water Conservation Districts at their 2025 annual meeting on January 7th, 2025. And we're recording it today just to make it available to a wider audience in case it may help those who are looking at ways to improve stream stability, floodplain stability, function after a large flood. So this presentation was, I guess, inspired by the events of Helene. We will show some examples of Helene damage in western North Carolina, but really it would be applicable anywhere that people are trying to think more about how to build our stream or restore our stream corridors to a more resilient form. All right, just wanted to give a little bit of background before I dive in to the presentation. My background is in fluvial geomorphology, which is this big phrase that really is just a combination of hydrology and geomorphology. It is the science of how water shapes the earth, and I have used this discipline or these experiences to work in the field of stream restoration for the last 30 years or so. I started my career as a natural resources extension agent in Gaston County, North Carolina, which is just to the west of Charlotte, where I focused on surface water issues, groundwater issues, and air quality, but then kind of moved more into surface water and stream restoration as time went on, and I moved to NC State University, where I co-founded the North Carolina Stream Restoration Program. And we focused on applied research, demonstration projects, and education. I'm also a landowner. I just wanted to point that out because I will be speaking throughout this presentation with kind of a focus on ag land. Again, it's not explicit to agricultural land, but I am a landowner. I'm not really an active farmer. It was a farm that we did a stream restoration project on years ago, and then fortunately was able to purchase that property from the landowner long after we did the stream restoration project. All right, so this presentation format is I'm going to spend a little bit of time just on how rivers work, a very simple look at that, and again more with the focus of how streams work during these big floods, and then after I get some fundamentals defined, we'll move into the resiliency part. So first I just wanted to talk about the power of water, because I think we've all stood beside a river at some point in time and marveled at the power of water. In this picture I'm standing beside Niagara Falls on the American side. I mean, the ground is shaking as this water pours over the falls. And in our world we can quantify stream power, and so this is just one of the more simple ways to quantify stream power, where we take the weight of water, which is pretty heavy, 62.4 pounds per cubic foot, times discharge, which is just the stream flow. So if you look in the picture, that volume of water moving over the falls is discharge, times the slope. So the slope is just how steep the river is, the gradient of the river. And so what I want you to think about as we think about power of water, stream power, is that as we increase discharge and or increase slope, we increase stream power. So for those of us that live in North Carolina, we've seen some big floods in our state. Helene in the mountains. Not too many years ago we had Florence in the eastern part of the state, and those were very, very big flood events in both cases, but their behavior, the behavior of that water, of those floods was quite different, because Florence was mostly in eastern North Carolina, the coastal plain, so that water just kind of came up like filling up a bathtub. It had pretty low power because it had such low slope. You compare that to Helene, where we dumped at max almost 30 inches of precipitation onto a mountain environment with steep slopes. The power of that water was tremendous. So I also want to talk about an equation called shear stress, and this is the last equation, only two equations in this presentation. So shear stress is a component of stream power. We have that weight of water again that's shown in this equation as gamma. We also still have slope, that's the S, but now instead of discharge we're just focused on depth. So shear stress is a force that we use a lot in stream restoration design because we can manipulate the form of the channel and the floodplain to affect shear stress. And so again, shear stress is a force. The lower that shear stress, the less force there is to move certain particle sizes. So low shear stress moves things like sand size material, maybe small gravel. Large shear stress can move bigger gravels, even into cobble, even into boulder size material, if that depth and slope are high enough to do it. And you can kind of see an example of that in this slide. You can see a little basket here. We went fishing for rocks. We had an event come through, a flow event. We came out after that flow event, dug through the sands and silts and gravels in our basket, and that last picture shows the largest particles that were moving during that event. So that's really what shear stress is used for, is the force for a given flow that can move particle sizes. So we start putting this together. With great power comes great, well, responsibility if you're Spider-Man, but if you're the river, it's sediment transport. So really, when we talk about sediment transport, we're talking about erosion and depositional processes. And we think about these big floods as that water is increasing. We've got the precipitation event, runoff starts, water is flowing into our channels. The depth of that flow in the channel is increasing. It's increasing shear stress, increasing stream power, and we often get erosion of the stream banks, maybe erosion of the bed. In the case of Helene, we also had landslides that were bringing material in, and the river is working that material. So there's a lot of erosion, especially on the front end and the peak of that flood. And then as the water begins to recede, stream power, shear stress goes down, and we get a lot of deposition. Often after big flood events, when we're walking those sites, we see a tremendous amount of deposition in the channel and on the floodplain. You can see an example of that here. This is from Helene. The picture in the upper left is before Helene. You can see a little bit of bank erosion, kind of some material over here. And then after Helene, you can just see the massive amount of material that was deposited on that falling limb of the flood. All right, so I think this is a nice schematic to start putting these two things together. This is a diagram that was put together by Emery Lane in 1955, and it just shows that if we're going to have a stable channel, we have to have a balance between stream power over here on the right and that sediment size and sediment supply over here on the left. So as we increase stream power, again, either by increasing slope or increasing the volume of the water, this arm goes down and this little pendulum swings over here to the to the degradation side. So too much stream power, then we often get degradation. And I don't love the word degradation because we use it for a lot of things. But in geomorphology, degradation means erosion of the stream bed. It means the channel is going to get deeper than it naturally would be. Incision is a synonym for degradation in our world. All right, on the other side, we have the sediment size and sediment supply. So if we keep stream power the same, but we increase the quantity of sediment and or the size of that sediment, so for example, instead of sand, we're moving a lot of cobble or boulder, then this arm can go down and we move over to the aggradation side. And that is the filling up of the bed with sediment, even depositing that material on the floodplain. That last picture was an example of aggradation. And again, we generally see both in these big floods. We see a lot of degradation in places, especially in the beginning part of the flood, and then aggradation as kind of the final result. All right, I also wanted to just touch on valley types, especially since I'm focused a little bit on the mountain environments, that the way this stream power plays out and really the way or the effects of these big events does vary a bit by valley type. There are many valley types. We could spend all day talking about the different valley types that are out there. But just for simplicity purposes and to convey some of the points I want to convey in this talk, we're just going to focus on 3 valley types. So the first is V-shaped. V-shaped valleys are generally headwater mountain valleys. They're fairly small watersheds, so small drainage areas, generally small volumes of water, but steep slopes. So the steep slope is kind of the higher part of the stream power equation, but the lower discharges is mitigating that stream power a bit. So the V-shaped valleys look like a V. They're kind of dominated by hill slope processes, so they're more vulnerable to things like landslides, hill slope failures, debris flows, and you can see there's really not a floodplain that's part of these V-shaped valleys. As we move downstream, the valleys tend to open up. The slope comes down a bit. The valleys begin to have more of a bowl shape to them, and we get what we call these benches, little floodplain benches that form, but it's still pretty narrow. It's also still fairly steep. It's not as steep as the V-shaped valleys, but we have more water. So again, thinking about stream power, we're increasing the discharge component of that power, but we're beginning to reduce the slope as well, again, to mitigate that power a bit. And then as we get further down in our idealized watershed, we move into the alluvial valleys. And you could think of the alluvial valleys as valleys that were built by the river. These are those meandering streams. Alluvium is just the material that was deposited by the river. The valleys tend to be wider. The slopes tend to be flatter. So we're picking up more water. Our discharge is increasing, but our slope is coming down. Now I mention this because, as we were touring some of the streams in western North Carolina after Helene, we noticed devastation in all of these valley types, which is a bit unusual. Typically, those V-shaped valleys and the colluvial or bowl-shaped valleys are a bit more resilient to floods, but because they don't produce as much water. But when you get 20 to 30 inches of precip on these slopes, multitude of processes come into play. And so we saw really devastation in all 3 valley types, but they were slightly different. So this big picture here on the right is the alluvial valleys. So again, wider floodplains, a little bit lower slope, typically bigger streams and rivers. We saw extensive bank erosion in these systems, and we also saw what we call channel avulsions, where new channels were formed as either you got a blockage in one channel or there was just too much power and it created a new channel elsewhere in the floodplain. As we got into the colluvial valleys and the V-shaped valleys, we still saw avulsions. In many cases, the stream just began to take the full width of the valley, but we also saw increasing influence from the landslides, from debris flows in these valleys. So it was really kind of a combination of disaster of landslides, debris flows, and flooding. And then, of course, we saw a lot of issues with stream crossings. And I'm not going to focus on stream crossings in this presentation, but really in both valley types, we saw a lot of material accumulating at bridges and culverts, blocking that, and then leading in some of the cases to the avulsions. All right, so I want to focus on the alluvial valleys a little bit more because that's typically where most people live and work. And I'm going to start with this idealized view of a valley. So this is an alluvial valley. You can see the meandering stream here that's essentially in the middle of the valley. And I kind of have to show this as an idealized view because it's pretty hard to find streams and alluvial valleys in North Carolina or eastern United States where it looks like this. This was really what our streams and valleys looked like before settlement, essentially. So this is more common. So we typically, for the last several hundred years, have taken these streams and straightened them. And we've moved them over to the edge of the valley to make that valley more available to human uses. So you can see the example here. The stream has moved over to the edge of the valley. Here's another one coming this way. And that just maximizes the room available to use in that valley. But what it does is, since we straighten the stream, it increases the slope, which increases the shear stress, and typically the result is that degradation. So most of our streams in North Carolina, and frankly, certainly across the eastern United States, most of the United States where there are alluvial valleys, our streams are incised or deeper than they should be, and have a lot and can carry a lot of shear stress when those channels are full of water. So then we kind of add the urban environment onto more of a rural environment, and not only straighten the stream, but we tend to widen and deepen the stream. So here's a schematic that shows the pattern and the dimension of a natural channel compared to the dimension and pattern of a channelized stream. And so we can see in the natural channel, we focus on these three widths, that the base flow is narrow and deep. There's a bankful channel, which just represents the natural size of a stream. If you let nature build the rivers, they generally will build these bankful channels. So that's what I mean by bankful. And so it's a moderate width and depth, moderate stream power, shear stress. And then there's a wide floodplain that can dissipate those flood flows. If we compare that to the channelized stream, you can see the base flow is much wider and actually shallower, so we have lower shear stresses at base flow. We've also widened out the bankful channel, so it also has a little bit less shear stress, but then we dramatically decrease the floodplain width, so that when we do have flows of this depth, we dramatically increase the shear stress. And so if we look over here to the left, here's an urban channel, and we can kind of see the result. Typically, the result of channelized streams is aggradation. And you can see these lighter colored areas in the channel. These are we call these alternating point bars. These are depositional features that have formed in that channelized stream because the bankful flow happens much more frequently than the big events, and it does not have enough shear stress and stream power to move that sediment load. However, when the big events do come through here, we tend to get devastating effects. Oops, and here's the case in point. So huge stream power equals huge disaster. This is not a North Carolina or even a United States picture. This is an example from Mexico of a tropical storm that came through, and just look at the power of that water in the channel and also trying to reclaim part of what used to be a floodplain, so eating into this highway. All right, so that was a little bit of the processes that I wanted to convey in as simple a way as I know how to do. And so now we're going to get to the question at hand. How do we improve stream corridor resiliency post-flooding disaster? And again, if we just focused on the agricultural side, how do we protect our agricultural land and see less of this erosion and deposition? So I'm going to offer 4 steps for doing this, just based on lessons learned from decades of stream restoration projects. So I'm going to walk through each of these, but the first one is that channel size matters. The second is that if you want to just simplify all of this, resiliency equals floodplain connectivity, and I'll show you why. 3, riparian vegetation supports that resiliency. And then 4th, a riffle pool sequence where we can incorporate large wood further dissipates energy and provides habitat. So the first one is just channel size matter. We showed that schematic of that bankful channel. When possible, when we have channels that have been destroyed or altered and we've got to go back and manipulate that channel, build bankful channels, and then put the flood flows on a bankful bench at a minimum, and preferably on a floodplain. And this is really easier than it might sound if you're fairly new to this, because if you know the drainage area of your project, you can get the bankful dimension. This is a for sure statement in North Carolina. We have these curves and equations throughout the state, and in many other states we have this as well. So it would be one thing to check. But if you know the drainage area, you can get that bankful dimension. And getting the drainage area is getting easier and easier. There are desktop tools to do both. You can just click on the site that you're working on. It'll give you the drainage area. You know the drainage area, you can get the proper size. So I just want to show some examples of how this plays out in the field. This is an example of a project that had a dam failure. So there was a dam here, and the remnants of Hurricane Michael several years ago, this is in Surry County, North Carolina, took that dam out. And so this was a project where the new channel had to be built through those sediments that had accumulated behind the dam. And so in the foreground here, you can see that bankful channel. In this case, the channel had already built to bankful, so the folks were able to just kind of take this template and apply it upstream and build a bankful width, a bankful depth, and then build this bankful bench. So it's not just sloped straight up to the top of bank, and there are not levees put in as well. This is actually the Friday that Helene hit, and this particular county is just in the foothills of the mountains. It did not get as much precipitation as up in the mountains. We did get about 12 inches of precip, but it was between Wednesday and Friday, so it was certainly not as big as some of the bigger tropical storms that have come through our system. But it's almost right at bankful flow here. Bankful's right here. You can see the faster moving water in the channel, and as water hits that bench, look how much lower or slower the water's moving on the bench. And then here was the high water mark from Helene. All right, so unfortunately we see a lot of this in western North Carolina right now, and it's understandable. People are just trying to survive. They're trying to get their land back. They're trying to protect themselves from the river, and it seems like taking that material from the channel and pulling it up on the banks and making these levees to keep the water in the channel seems intuitive, right? It seems like the right thing to do, but it does not work. And the reason it doesn't work is that, again, as we get those moderate to larger flows coming through here, we're maximizing shear stress in the channel. And all of this unconsolidated material, this mixture of sands, silts, gravels, and cobbles without any soil or root material, trees to hold this in place, is just going to erode back into the channel. It'll aggregate, begin to fill up with sediment. And then additionally, this type of activity will cause flooding downstream. You know, you're taking that water, and instead of spreading it out onto a floodplain, it's moving downstream and could flood others as well. It's also potentially a permit violation. So there are certain things we can do post-disaster in a channel to kind of get that initial recovery, but only to a certain point. So there's a permitting question with this as well. All right, so really just want to kind of finish up the thought on these bankful channels and kind of a nod towards our agricultural areas. Just with this phase, I'm just focused on channel size. So it could be that the stream needs to stay in place. Maybe, again, it has been moved over to the edge of the valley. But at a minimum, I'm just going to zoom in, we could get that bankful channel built, a bankful bench. We're going to talk about the riparian vegetation in a few minutes, and then we can continue to farm the valley outside of that area. But reducing that bank heights with this bankful bench is really a key component. All right, so number 2, resiliency equals floodplain connectivity. And the reason that it does is that floodplains keep the shear stress low. So here's a project in Banner Elk, North Carolina. This is in a county that was hit hard by Helene. This is a project that was built in the early 2000s, It is on a farm. This part of the project was fenced out. This part of the farm was maintained as pasture land, and then some other ag uses. And then this part of the farm was turned into a development. But we can see a couple of things. We have that step one, so this is a bankful channel. So all flows greater than bankful can now spread out onto a wide area. In addition, there was a meandering channel put back in place. So the meandering channel reduces slope. So we're reducing that stream power and shear stress in two ways: by accessing the floodplain at more frequent events, and then by spreading that water out onto the floodplain. Well, there's a law with stream restoration called Murphy's Law, and Murphy's Law states that as soon as you build a stream restoration project, you will get a large flood. So a couple of years after building this project, the remnants of 2 hurricanes came through this site within like a week of each other. Hurricanes Francis and Ivan. And you can see that event occurring here. This is not quite the peak. The water did go over the road, but it's still obviously during the event. And what I want you to notice is the velocities and shear stress of the water on the floodplain. It's pretty low because we're spreading water out. When we spread water out, that increase in depth is minimized. So we're minimizing shear stress on the floodplain the wider we can make that floodplain. Compare this picture to the one we showed before, where we're concentrating all of that massive flood event into one channel, trying to contain it. So this is why I say floodplain connectivity equals resiliency. We kind of don't care how much more water comes down through this system because we're just spreading it out onto a big floodplain. And then here's that same project after Helene. So you can see 20 plus years of vegetation growth. The only really evidence you can see from the aerial of Helene is this riding rink. Had a lot of gravel that was washed from the rink into the riparian area. And then in a lot of places, the fence was damaged. But when we walked that site, this is post-Helene, where we're walking the stream, and honestly, you couldn't tell a flood had been through there. The pools were still deep. The bed had not aggraded. We saw fish in this pool. There were beaver dams in one section of the stream. The beaver dams were still intact. They had not even washed away, and we had these good wetland features in the floodplain that were enhanced by the beaver activity. Okay, so we've focused on building our smaller channels, number one. Number two, connecting those channels to the floodplain. And number three, we want to bring in reinforcements. And the reinforcements is that riparian vegetation. We're going to focus from a resiliency and stability perspective on the fact that that vegetation does provide bank stability of the stream banks itself, and then it slows water on the floodplains. But there are other ecological benefits as well. It cools stream temperatures, which in western North Carolina is important. We have a lot of cold water streams that support cold water fish, and so helping keep those temperatures low is important for those species. It provides habitat for aquatic and riparian species, and then it is a source of organic matter and large wood. So the organic matter is primarily the leaf material that gets into the stream. It's an energy source, a food source for many of those aquatic organisms. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more about the large wood in a few minutes. So here's an example of this playing out. Here's another farm. This is in Surrey County. Before the cows were fenced out, and we're standing on a bridge looking downstream. This bank is very tall, and so over time the erosion just became extensive on this project. But notice the bank heights. It's very high. And so riparian vegetation is very important, but first reducing that bank height is key. And so the first step here was back to that step one, getting the bankful channel built by finding that bankful elevation and then building a little floodplain bench. In this case, we couldn't take the whole valley. We could only take a small section of the corridor. So here's the bench. It sloped up to a terrace, and the terrace was maintained in pasture land. A couple of years later, you can see that riparian vegetation beginning to grow, mostly herbaceous vegetation at this point. And then 20 years later, we have a very nice riparian forest. But I just want to point out the trees that have grown on the right side were able to grow from that bench. So we're getting root mass down near the toe of the bank, which is key, because if we're talking about bank stability, it's a bottoms up approach. We have to first have a stable bed, then a stable toe, and then we can achieve a stable top of that bank. So having these low bank heights and this bench really helps us maximize the benefit of that riparian vegetation. And then here's just an aerial shot of that. All those pictures were taken from this road looking downstream. So we had our bench, and then here's that pretty thin layer, thin width of riparian vegetation here, but it works because the ag area is on a terrace, so a higher elevation than the floodplain. The floodplain does have that bench, and it has good vegetation. One thing that this picture I don't think really shows, I mean, because this section was pretty straight, really all that we had to do to get vegetation was plant. But when you get into bends, like a meander bend, we do have more stress on the outside of that bend. And so we have to often use other techniques for stabilizing this portion of a stream. So I just wanted to acknowledge that there are numerous methods for stabilizing banks that incorporates wood and natural materials. So this example is toewood, where whole trees, root mass intact with trunks, tops of trees, are used below the stream bed up to the base level to create that stable toe. And then in this example, transplants were placed on top of the wood to hold it in place and make up the stream bank. And then there are bioengineering methods. This one is called geolifts, where you take these soil lifts and fabric, like a coir matting, and then in between those lifts we put live cuttings, and it's a pretty robust method for building stream banks and meander bends. It can withstand quite a bit of shear stress and velocity. There are numerous methods for bioengineering to go along with this. I just wanted to point out a couple. And one reason I wanted to point this out is as we were touring these sites in western North Carolina post-Helene, we saw all of these facilities that were bringing the massive amount of woody debris, these trees, to a site to get mulched. And it was painful for me to see that, because just beside this particular facility, there was a farm with all this bank erosion from Helene. Like, we could have used the trees from this material to create what you see in these upper pictures. But there's a lot of logistics involved in that, and there's some complications, but the more that we can do that, the better. Like, these floods produce a lot of woody debris, and it is debris that we can use in the sort of restoration, reclamation side of things. All right, the last thing I just wanted to mention is that the riffle pool sequence and large wood does further help dissipate energy and provide habitat. So here's another project on a farm. Here's one where they did give the entire valley width back to the stream, and then they maintained their pasture land up on the hill slopes and the terraces. Again, I'm still just primarily focusing on the alluvial valleys and meandering streams for this presentation. But what I want to point out is when we have this opportunity and we can put this meandering pattern back, pools will form in the outside of the bend, and the riffles form between the meander bends in the straight sections. And these riffles are the natural grade control feature for the river. That's what's helping us maintain the floodplain connectivity. And then the pools, by being deeper, are also helping to dissipate energy. And then I mentioned the wood as well, so I'm just going to zoom in. This is a younger project. You can see here are the riffles coming into the pools. Here's another riffle. And so a combination of rock and wood are used to achieve that short-term stability. But the wood is anchored in place, so it's not wood that's just going to mobilize during the big events. And one thing I like about this picture is you can kind of see all of the steps that we've talked about coming into play. This channel was built as a bankfull channel, so all flows greater than that bankfull flow are going to spread onto the floodplain. So there's the floodplain connectivity. Riparian vegetation has been planted. It's just a young project, so you don't see much, just the herbaceous. And then here's that riffle pool sequence, providing both the stability but also the habitat. You know, pools are really important for fish. The riffles are really important for macroinvertebrates. That's a bit of an oversimplification, but for generalization purposes, you could think of fish in the pools and the bugs in the riffles. And then here's a little more mature project, same kind of thing. Here's that pool. This is a toewood example. So all of this is actually wood that was put in and then transplants above that. And if we do all this, it not only provides resiliency for the human uses that we want onto that floodplain, but it does support stream corridor function and habitat for aquatic life. So from a recreational perspective, it provides better fishing. But beyond the recreational component, all of these things help improve the biodiversity of the stream and the floodplain. And we've lost a lot of our aquatic and riparian species over time through habitat loss. So in doing these 4 steps, not only can we improve the resiliency of the system, provide more stability to our ag uses, for example, less erosion, less deposition, but we can provide a home for the aquatic wildlife that lives there, both flora and fauna, and hopefully to see these species continue in our lifetime, and that for future generations can see and appreciate as well. So in summary, to rebuild these stream corridors that are more resilient to large floods, do the following. Build those bankfull channels. Connect those bankfull channels to at least a bankfull bench. We can really always do that, or almost always do that. And better yet, connect it to the floodplains, plant that stream bank and riparian vegetation, and then when possible, incorporate that riffle pool sequence and wood to further enhance stability and also provide that aquatic habitat. And I just wanted to let those, well, really anyone working in ag environments across the country, and you're working within RCS and soil and water district programs, there are resources available. Like everything that I have shared is in the National Engineering Handbook, NRCS's National Engineering Handbook, Part 654. It is a huge document. In North Carolina, there's been a lot of focus historically and currently on Chapter 11 of this engineering handbook, which is the Rosgan geomorphic channel design. And there's even been kind of enhancements and evolutions off of that method for today. I mentioned bioengineering. There's an entire technical supplement in this design manual on bioengineering, and there is help available. So, you know, again, in North Carolina and really the other states, there's an engineering services section. The engineering services section in North Carolina for the Division of Soil and Water Conservation is very active and helpful in these methods. There are NRCS programs that can fund these types of projects as well as provide technical assistance. And then there are many engineering firms that have technical service providers, which is a requirement for NRCS to do these methods. So there is help available if folks want to do this. So I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, you can reach out. You can email me at wharman, which is WHARMAN @stream-mechanics.com. And I hope this was helpful. Thank you.